Hi, APUSH kids. So what you're looking at right there is I filled in and typed the Chapter 25 AMSCO notes for the beginning, really up to page 530. And that's what I want to talk about today. So if you want to, you can pause this video and you can fill in my notes, or you can just fill in as I talk. But I'm going to kind of work down this sheet. And this is a sheet that's available for you. If you look at your Google Classroom resources. It looks a lot different than mine because, like I said, I typed in and filled it out. I gave you the one to write on, but again, you can just do what you want with this. And to be honest, maybe I'll download this as well. So we're going to talk about Franklin Roosevelt's role in all the chaos of foreign policy in the 1930s, the chaos that's what's happening with Germany and Japan and Italy. And honestly, we're dealing with a Great Depression in this decade, and that's the main focus on Franklin Roosevelt's mind. But in the back of his mind, he's watching. The world is watching as Italy with Benito Mussolini and Germany with Adolf Hitler are being very belligerent throughout Europe and making belligerent statements. And they're a type of government, fascism, that is nothing like American democracy. You know, and Hitler sort of, the mistakes of Versailles, his brown shirts sort of forced their way in. And, you know, he's pretty charming in the beginning, and Time magazine names him Man of the Year in 1935. And he's got this charm about him with young people in Germany because he gives them hope and the promise of a better Germany and this German nationalism. But ultimately, things turn pretty quickly as he advances throughout the 30s into the Rhineland region, and then Sudetenland, and then Austria, and declares Anschluss, and eventually into Poland, which was sort of the last straw that led to 39 in the war. At the same time, Mussolini, who's sort of Adolf Hitler light, is invading countries like Ethiopia and Albania, which are probably much easier to invade, but nevertheless, he's taking over territory. And the United States' role throughout this is neutrality. We pledge a sequence of up to 4 Neutrality Acts, and you can write that down. I don't have that in great detail there, but 4 Neutrality Acts, letting the world know that we are isolated and we will not make the mistakes that we made in the past. Of course, we know where this is going, and each Neutrality Act is a little bit closer to helping who will end up being our allies than the one before. Simultaneously, Japan is being a menace in terms of China and Southeast Asia and taking territory, and that's another story that we'll talk about in a future video. So we'll focus on, first of all, the good neighbor policy. FDR knows that Germany and Italy are menaces. He does not want them in Latin America. So what he is doing is ultimately telling Latin America that, hey, we want to be your friends, you know, like a good neighbor, FDR's there. That's how I always remember that one. I don't know if that commercial is before your time or not. Plus, it's money, and we need money. Potential trade partners and people throughout a decade that were pretty desolate. But ultimately, you're going to see a dramatic shift once the war begins in U.S. policy. Because in the very beginning of the war, so I'm looking at, it says changing U.S. policy. Technically, we are neutral. But this cash and carry policy, which says, hey, if you pay us up front, you can take away some weapons, really favors the British because they have the naval blockade at that point. And it's going to be very similar to World War I with the British blockade and the German U-boats. And what's happening right now is, and I sort of cruise through this, but Great Britain is fighting alongside of France, who's sort of occupied, and the Scandinavian countries are occupied, and Great Britain is fighting alongside of them, and Joe Stalin in the Soviet Union. So a very strange friend, but again, they're you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that's sort of our and Britain's position when it comes to the Soviet Union, the Russians. Britain is led by a man named Winston Churchill at this point. The previous leader was an appeaser, and if you don't know what appeasement is, it's like when I threaten my daughter when she's making mistakes, and I tell her that I'm going to email her teacher Well, I've said that so many times, and I haven't emailed her teacher, so she's learned that I've appeased her and she can get away with more. So ultimately that, you can hear my cat meowing right now, ultimately that is what's going on with the policy in terms of Neville Chamberlain, and he'll be replaced by Churchill, and my cat's hitting the thing around here. Riley Joe, stop. Ultimately that's what's happening with Churchill. Now that the wars began, there is no more appeasement like Chamberlain. So it's a blitzkrieg, it's a lightning war. Britain's getting bombed. They're not overtaken by Germany at this point, but because they have the water as obviously as a barrier. But the Germans and the Italians are fighting against those three countries, and we are selling weapons to basically Britain because they're paying cash up front. But it's a neutral policy to make us money. FDR knows that this war in early 1940 is a possibility, and he institutes the first peacetime draft in this country, and that means 1.2 million Americans are drafted in the military, which made isolationists really, really angry because they don't want to go to war again like World War I. Of course, public feelings are starting to pick up against Germany. And the public is starting to shift, although they still don't want war. And that's, FDR's walking a tightrope here. And so he ends up trading destroyers for military bases in British Islands. And he was very clever. It was older destroyers, so he could get away with. So we weren't selling Great Britain or taking a side. We were still, quote, neutral, but he's selling trading destroyers for some military strategic bases throughout the ocean. In 1940, the unprecedented thing happens. Franklin Roosevelt is the first U.S. president to breach George Washington's two-term limit. No president can do it now because after FDR was elected to an unprecedented fourth term, once the Republicans took over Congress and the White House, took over Congress, they made sure that they were going to pass the 22nd Amendment, which was going to forbid any president from breaching the two-term limit. Washington didn't want a president to be king-like, and some people say FDR was sort of a reign of an imperial president. But FDR said that if he was asked to be president and nominated, he would accept, in part because, you know, you want your veteran on the mound, little baseball reference, you want your veteran on the mound in your big game, and the world is at war at this point. So he beats Wendell Willkie, not the route of the earlier two elections, but nevertheless a win. At that point, shortly after he gets reelected, he makes a very famous speech where he says that the United States must be the arsenal of democracy. Let me translate that. And you can see it in italics right there on the sheet. It means the United States must be the great supplier of weaponry, okay, for countries that are like us. Hint, hint, Britain and France. So he's letting people know. And he makes a very famous speech in 1941 where he says that all people, human beings, deserve four basic freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Something that I think is still true today and resonates. In March of 41, we shifted from cash and carry to what's called the Lend-Lease Act, where we permit Great Britain to buy arms without having to put cash up front because they don't have a lot of money up front. And so we're sort of transitioning. We're neutral, but are we really neutral? Well, we're not, because now we find out later that FDR and Winston Churchill meet in the Atlantic Ocean on a ship off the coast of Canada and discuss post-war peace. And they must be discussing like, hey, I got to find a way to get in this war, but I got to get the American people behind me. And of course, as you know, Japan is going to do a great favor in one way through a great tragedy. And that'll be the next video that we talk about. The last thing, as we get into the summer months, the United States is transitioned to shoot on sight, that we will fire upon any kind of German U-boat. And we are transitioning into this war before we're even into the war. So I'm going to stop right there. Thank you for joining me. My next video will be about Pearl Harbor, and then we'll discuss the United States at war on two fronts, in the Pacific and in Europe, and we'll also discuss the United States on the home front. Thank you very much for joining me. Take care.